Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hillbilly Drug Baby. I'm Andrea Brunet,
And I'm Chris Giles.
and the two of us are here with our second episode, along with Chris's guitar as our third voice.
Yahoo!
And our fourth voice is Jessie Ray Lewis, aka the Hillbilly Drug Baby, and he's the author of Hillbilly Drug Baby, the poems. As we told you in episode 1, he's not here in the room with us, but he's here in spirit. And just as a quick reminder, I'm the author of Hillbilly Drug Baby, the story, which tells about how Jessie Ray Lewis came into my life, and Chris is here to help me, and hopefully you, make sense of that story. Chris has roots here, unlike me. Chris, why don't you give us your little capsule history?
Well, I was born and raised in the Roanoke, Virginia area, educated here, and have lived all my life in Southwest Virginia, other than a year's stint in college down in North Carolina. My family's been in this region anywhere from Maggie Valley to Matewan, Eastern Tennessee, and Kentucky for a little over 200 years, according to my father. And, these are my people and the way I know things.
So I'm a Flatlands foreigner, or a Flatlands foreigner, is that how they say it?
Well, like anyway.
And you're the real deal, and so you are schooling me on things from time to time.
I'm trying to bring you over to our lick log.
To what?
Bring you over to our lick log, our way of doing things. A lick log used to be an old way that people in the South and what have you would put salt out for cattle and other animals. They would find a hollow log there on the farm and fill that up. So we call it a lick log, where the cattle or sheep or whoever else that needed the minerals could go get it. That's just an old saying like that. It's not meant in a derogatory. We don't know it that way.
Well, I've read about a salt lick, but I've never heard about a lick log.
Actually, that's a Bill Clinton quote.
Bill Clinton
Said it on television, yes.
No.
We're trying to get them over to our lick log. Then he explained it later.
Bill Clinton said that?
Many years ago when he was first, running for president.
I don't remember that.
Well, face it, some guy walks up and gives you an Appalachian type saying. You remember that.
I think that would have stuck in my mind.
It doesn't make me like him any more or less, but I remember him saying it.
Are you saying you didn't like Bill Clinton?
I'm not saying any of that at all. It just says it didn't change anything.
All right, we'll talk about that later, maybe. So first, let's do our APB for Jessie Ray. Where's Jessie Ray? We still don't know. After our last episode, he did not check in. So if you're listening, Jessie Ray, it's time to check in so we know where you are. We haven't heard from him since he took off for Myrtle Beach. So once again on the pod, we'll start with a flashback, then move on to the poetic phrase of the week. And please make sure you stay all the way to the end, because today Chris is the one with the rant, and it's a doozy. So let's get started. This first segment is the flashback, where I look back on something that happened during the time that Jessie Ray Lewis spent with me and my husband. And the flashback always involves something that I still haven't figured out. Chris, what's your flashback music for us today?
I would think it was something with kind of a... railroad kind of beat thing, something.
Well, that was kind of upbeat and nice. And now I'm going to talk about something that kind of broke my heart about Jessie Ray. He told me something that ended up being a verse in his poem, Happy. That's the title of the poem, Happy. He said, "Where I'm from, you are never a kid. They told me that if you can walk and talk, you're not a kid." So Jessie Ray's grandmother, who essentially raised him, told him about how she'd been raped, and he was way too young to hear something like that. I mean, how do you tell a child about that? But she did. He never got stories read to him. He never had things that other kids might call fun. So just to give a little idea of his childhood, I want to play an excerpt from a different poem, 7 and 7, read by Daniel Etty Williams, and this is from the audio version of Jessie Ray's book of poems.
I remember being on the playground thinking, damn, If I jumped off this slide, I could go home, sneak into my dad's room, and take some of them candies that made me feel silly. Once, I ate 7 and felt like I was going to heaven. I was 7 years old. Didn't know what they were until my dad caught me and taught me how to snort them properly.
So you get an idea of what his home life was like. He was always worried. He was worried when he would talk to me and Hal. And when I would talk to him about his childhood, he always sounded like he was worried when he was a kid at home. And when his grandmother talked to him, she didn't spare him her own worries. So, my question is, do you think this is solely related to the fact that all the adults around him had drug problems? Or is there some connection to Appalachia in this?
I've seen situations that remind me of things like this in other people's communities, in other people's, states and countries. And I listen to it and I'm going, well, you'd think that in a place that's often compared with Mayberry RFD, that we'd have Aunt B and not some monster to take her place. That we did things in a very simple and wholesome, let's change that, and just a very easy familial way. Let's all sit down to dinner, discuss our day, we have a regularity. We have comfort that Jessie Ray obviously lacked. Grandma sitting there scared out of her wits, parents, of a wide variety of different parental figures.
So, what you're saying is that these kinds of families probably exist in many places, but in Appalachia, the contrast is amazing because there is this other world that is small town life, neighbor loves neighbor, very close family ties.
Yes.
As an aberration, it's in such a contrast to the picture of what Jessie Ray must have known other families were like.
He could see it, and he couldn't figure out why these people couldn't do the same thing or something similar. He probably never thought once they had to be exactly like this, but more like that would be better than not. I mean, read the poetry. He's asking why in every verse. Sometimes he's answering his own questions, and the question is almost always answered the same way. Because it is. And I can't change it. I mean, the helplessness of a child. You can make ideas clear to your parental figures, but make them understand and do? Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't happen, right?
You always make me think of something I hadn't thought of before, and what I'm thinking of now when you're talking about the culture that his experience was inset into. It was different from being say, a street child in Brazil, where you're in a big city and many of those children live in horrible circumstances, but they look around and they see a teeming city all around them and they see many other kids scrapping to survive. Jessie Ray was in a family unit, saw something completely different out in the culture and in school, and could only compare that and contrast that to his own situation at home.
Yeah, it was simply not even closely parallel. I mean, matter of fact, disparate is what I would say. I mean, it's completely different from the description, and what we've talked about and the writings in the book. He's intelligent enough, creative enough, capable enough to walk out of this, yet somehow he's tethered to it.
Yes, that's a theme. He goes back to it. When he ends up homeless later on in his later teen years, he has many fights with his dad. He doesn't get along with his dad, despises his dad, and where does he end up? Back with his dad.
Sometimes I hear people compare it to something like Stockholm Syndrome. You're sort of attached to the people who are your captors. I mean, you can get that too. He needs parental figures, he needs guidance, he wants those things. It's part of being a child.
I'm glad you brought up his poetry because that's a great segue for the poetic phrase of the week. Have you
Okay.
got some music to get us there?
Well, I guess so. Let's see. What are we going to need? Try something a little melancholy.
Now for the poetic phrase of the week. You have to have a strong stomach to read Jessie Ray's poetry. When I've showed it to people, experienced people, worldly people, I've seen them brought to tears. So I want to play a little section of the poem Torment, read here by Daniel Etty Williams. And this is from the audio version of the book Hillbilly Drug Baby, the Poems by Jessie Ray Lewis.
I'm going back to being an asshole, a fucking savage with no regrets. Trying to vent the fumes of chemicals that would burn someone's retinas out to make them see the darkness I see. 2 knees on the ground, screaming, "Please, man, please!" His pleas mean nothing to me. I feed on them. I love to hear the scream, dream of the pain I've experienced. Try to get rid of it through him as he chokes on puke and blood.
So that might seem over the top, but there's something authentic about the way he uses these words. And I believe that he's seen things like this. If not exactly this, he's seen things very similar close up in real life that approximate what he's describing in his poetry.
Andrew, would you call the things that he saw and the things he experienced brutal?
Many of them, yes.
Well, these are certainly brutal words that create brutal images in the mind of many people, myself included. I mean, and you said that others, who are obviously well-educated and responsible, well-developed people in society read them and broke down. Well, I mean, he's just speaking what's on his mind. When you have the same thing happen to you over and over again, it is ongoing, traumatic, and recurring. And why wouldn't it leave such an ability to articulate it, because it's been so intense in his mind for so long?
And we talked some in episode 1 about how much of it is true, and that's why I believe that a lot of what he had to say was true. I don't think you can conjure these things up if you haven't seen at least some of it.
Yeah, I mean, okay, 100%? I don't know. But substantially? Yeah, I'm on board with that. He experienced this. In whatever mind frame he was, that's what's in his mind, especially if he says it more than once. He thinks it's so.
Well, when you were reading his poetry, how did you react to it?
Most of his poetry are 3 and 4 lines. And each one is just a few words. Each line, just a few words. Well, usually the more, cryptic, the shorter it is. A lot of people would say, well, that could mean a lot of things. But in our culture, no, I don't think so. I know what he's pointing to. I can't pull it out exactly, but what he's saying is that these words are going to create an image that not all people from this region would understand, but those who have experienced similar things would.
How did you feel when you were reading his poems?
Oh, at first I'm going, wow. I mean, have you ever been at the beach and stood up in front of a wave, not knowing it was there, and it hit you kind of in the face? And that's kind of the easiest way for me to say it. I mean, I was shocked and appalled, and my mind was immediately like, wow, what experiences do I have that are like this? I mean, that's what I think really makes people break down, is that they're not used to this at all.
You mean when people read it and cry because they don't...
This is something they have tried to avoid all their lives. They sort of pushed it out of their minds that, well, this only happens in books. Somebody has to think this up. And somebody makes it a bit more real than literature or fiction. Somebody made this real. Here's the person. This is what this person experienced. And then they experienced enough of it where they could write about it in poetic verse. That's a lot of experience.
And in very ordinary language, and as you said, with brevity, with great brevity, he transports you.
With great metaphor. I mean, that is the language, I think, one of the common cores of the language of this region. And metaphor, analogy, colloquy, as we spoke before, are the things that other people don't get because they don't see the context. So, we're trying to be friendly and kind with it so that it doesn't, the gruesomeness of what is really underneath of it doesn't come out and bite you at first.
You talk about being shocked and appalled at what you read, and that's because of his subject matter. He talks about what he endured as a child, abuse, drug abuse, really as far back as when he was a toddler, he was given drugs, all through his childhood. And then later on, when he was part of a gang, he was selling drugs, he was cooking drugs, and he was also kind of the enforcer who was exacting violence on people who didn't pay or whatever. I mean, that's how he described his role. So those things were also shocking and appalling. And I can see that this is his experience, this is his truth. But I'm anticipating that as his work becomes more known, Hillbilly Drug Baby, the poems, and then my book, Hillbilly Drug Baby, the story, we may be in for some criticism.
Oh, I'm sure.
Why? Why are you talking about this? Why are you bringing up these unpleasant things? Why are you talking about the bad things about the Appalachian culture? And I bet we'll get that question.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. Matter of fact, the first podcast, those questions raised in my mind, that people are going to say, no, wait a minute, you're just pulling legs and, you're just trying to get attention, abusing people that you shouldn't be abusing. But, I mean, we didn't make this up. You didn't make this up. Somebody came to you with this story and told it to you. Someone who lived here, someone who's been through these things. Now, I mean, I think it's worthy of an exposition here. You don't have to say anything or do anything about it. You don't have to feel about it. But you need to know that it is true. I mean, to the best of our ability, these things are so. And I think that quietly in many people's minds, they will know something similar and they will empathize. They will at least say, well, yeah, sure hate it, but it's out there. And the people that don't are the ones that, well, need to recognize these things and need to know that this is here. It's not because it's in Appalachia. I think this is in lots of communities and lots of different places. This is just where you'd think the likelihood of it would be far less.
And it's not just that someone came and told me a story, Jesse Ray came and told me his story. It's that he was telling his own story, but he considered it worthless. He was writing down these lines on scraps of paper, and Hal, my husband, is the one who discovered it. He saw there were these scraps of paper on the floor, and he picked it up and unrolled it and said, well, what is this? And Jesse Ray said, oh, this is just something I wrote last night. And Hal didn't know how to evaluate it, but he knew that I was a writer and an editor. And he looked at it and said, Jesse Ray, you need to save these. You're going to want to look back at this. Jesse had been throwing away everything that he ever wrote. To him, it had no value. He couldn't conceive of it ever having value. So I saw not just a story, but I saw a storyteller. And I saw writing and a writing talent that I thought that maybe if he were channeled, his writing talent could pull him up above, could maybe give him a new life, that someone not so talented might not have that option.
Yeah. The strength this fellow had to face himself, to face this situation. And, when you read just 3 lines, the thought is so complete and yet so not forceful, but so powerful in how far it reaches into you. Because all of a sudden it went past your defenses and into the place in your mind where you keep your bad memories stored. Things you witnessed that you wished you hadn't. You know that old saying, what has been seen cannot be unseen? Yeah, it can be stored in a drawer in the back of your mind. But all of a sudden that came forward. I mean, it did with me. I mean, I felt that I went, gee whiz, and all I hear every page that I read is the question, why? I mean, I think that's probably one of the things you and Al knows. This powerful mind, this incredible ability to see abstract thought in things and then articulate it. I mean, how many people out of 100 can do what he does? How many people out of 1,000? How many people out of 10,000?
And he didn't have even a good K-12 education. When he came to us, he didn't know his times tables, for example. Somehow he had gotten a high school degree because eventually they wanted to get rid of him.
Right.
But he'd never learned the times tables, was not highly literate in many ways, and yet look at this.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, these are some of the things that kind of like, well, slapped me. I mean, I don't mean that in the literal sense, but I mean, it was quite shocking what it made you feel instantly. And it went right past my defenses. Not too many things do. I mean, after looking at the internet for the number of years we all have for information, entertainment, and other things, you're a little tougher. This came around the corner from a place you didn't expect it to.
And that's exactly what poetry is supposed to do.
Yeah, art. Makes you think.
Yeah, and so I'm going to be really sad if people condemn the book. A lot of times people will condemn things without reading it, and they may dislike the use of the word hillbilly. They may also be unhappy. Why are you perpetuating stereotypes? And what's going to happen if that's the reaction is that this promising young voice is going to be squelched and his story won't be told. And I think his story deserves to be told.
It's a special story, no doubt about that. I'm with you. I really am. Because this is, like I said, you've been working on this for a while, and it lived here with you. The whole idea, the notion. Not that I'm calling him some sort of it, please. That's not it at all. But this whole thing lived with you here.
Yes.
How can you not be affected by such a thing in ways that will be hard to imagine?
I've been writing all my life. I've made my living as a writer, and I was just in awe of some of the things that he would send me. I could know
yeah.
more. I couldn't make this stuff up. And he lived it.
Yeah, and survived it.
Survived it to the age of, he turned 20 in January. So,
Pushing 21 here.
fingers crossed.
Yay. Yeah.
All right, I think we need some music. We're going to go into our factoid next.
Okay, factoid.
All right, here's the factoid. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Almost half of homeless teens end up in a detention center or jail. And sometimes they stay locked up because they don't have a home to go back to. There are advocates working at the national level to try to get judges' attention on this, to make them aware of how their decisions, the judges' decisions, often, and here's a quote, make the difference between whether their next stop after the courtroom is a home, a shelter, or under a bridge, close quote. Jesse Ray was homeless, and during the time he was with us, he also spent a few days in jail, and we'll talk about that in a future pod. So being a lawyer, Chris, I'm sure you've got some sort of reaction to that.
Yes, and it's one of sadness, because it's not the first time I've seen many similar situations. You don't talk about them. You're not really allowed to if they're, within confidence. And there's a system all across the United States that handles things like this. One of the reasons you don't hear about them is because these are called courts not of record. Only the people and interested parties generally are allowed in. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends upon the jurisdiction, the matter, and the people who are involved. And they try to be as private about this as possible. Who in the world wants to air their dirty laundry and all of this, in an open place? Nobody would want to do that.
Well, I just assumed that the judges knew, of course, that their decisions were having an impact on the homeless teens coming in. But according to these advocates, the judge may not even be thinking about that.
Put yourself in the judge's position. I mean, just for a moment. And that's kind of a tough thing to do for somebody who hasn't been to law school, hasn't practiced law, and hasn't been taught to do all these things. The Constitution bears down on you from one angle. The state Constitution bears down on you another. Bodies of law bear down on you from another angle. Then the people in front of you, and good old-fashioned common sense. I mean, there's a legal and an illegal, and there's a right and a wrong.
Do judges always have common sense?
Well, I don't know. I don't know them all.
In your experience?
I wouldn't touch that with a 10-meter cattle prod, Miss Brunet.
You notice I've been trying to lure you in.
She is. She's just punishing me, I'm going to charge her more for this. Well, anyway, the nature of this process is ugly. And
the nature of
somebody who's not accustomed to this, not accustomed to the legal process, wouldn't see all the things that have to happen. And not to mention, when you know the person who's on the bench, and you know the counsel that's involved, at least reasonably well, you can see in their eyes and their faces, they're trying to hold up. But you can see the person inside, and they hurt. I have listened to it. You wouldn't recognize it because you're one of the claimants or one of the parties that are involved in the thing. You wouldn't see it. But only someone with experience that could look at that person and say, I know they look like a very stodgy, sort of brick wall kind of person. And you can see in those eyes and little bits of places in their face that they're on the verge of crying because they don't want to do what they have to do. It's tough.
All right, your music needs to take us from the factoid to the rant.
Okay, something a little.
Very nice. Okay, the rant is yours today,
Oh my. Go
but
ahead. Start us off.
but
But,
I've got
but.
a little something to share with you about Jesse Ray. He went to church with me a couple of times under duress, pretty much. And he shared with this very small congregation in this very small church that he had been told if he ever stepped foot in a church, he would spontaneously combust. So
What?
he was trying to tell the congregation that he had no business being in a church. He would never go into church. He was, I guess, so blasphemous and so anti-religion that if he ever did step foot, that he would burst into flames, literally. Now, this being Jesse Ray and him being a storyteller and always full of metaphor, he had everyone in stitches. He was very funny with it. But he really had no use for religion. So now I'm going to turn it over to you to rant about a certain billboard that you saw in Virginia as you were driving on the way to West Virginia.
Yeah, it was in Pembroke, Virginia. There's a sign up on the hillside, and if I'm not mistaken, it's a passage from Hebrews 9:22. But it wasn't attributed that I could see on the sign, but I was, driving by, so I didn't really notice. And we all know what that is about, and it easily states that there is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood, is its basic context. Many people interpret it different ways, and if you read previously to that in the Bible and you read past that, you'll see that the context maybe isn't quite as gruesome as it initially sounds. But leaving that up like that, I often wonder that there is no forgiveness without this act, or without this notion, or without this thing. Why do we have to be so angry? Why do we have to be this vindictive just because someone told us we had to be?
That's a great question. I mean, I understand Christianity talks about Christ shedding his blood for all of us, but out of context like that, to me, it has a menacing quality. Is that how you reacted?
Well, I began to wonder if somebody wasn't trying to send that message. That they were angry and they are tired of feeling as if they are the enemy. You want me to forgive you? Well, you're going to have to pay for it this time.
Or I want to see some
You have
bloodshed.
pushed sometimes in my own mind's eye, and this may be entirely wrong, but you have pushed me past Christianity's boundaries. I don't know. It was one of those things that startled me. I'd never seen Christianity up in my face like that. Maybe they didn't mean anything wrong or making it as gruesome as I'm telling you what I feel about it, what I think about it, as opposed to what actually somebody else. I'm not accusing them of saying it. They put it up there. That in order for forgiveness, there must be something given for it. And I interpret that as whatever it is that's given for it will be dear, of a high price. I don't mean as necessarily a shedding of blood. Maybe that's just a cold metaphor. Perhaps that's what it is. But by the same token, it got my attention. If you wanted to get my attention, you have it.
Well, maybe that billboard served its purpose.
Evidently. It got my attention. I told you about it, and it brought up your curiosity as well. What do you mean by that? Well, there are a lot of people that don't like outsiders. Doesn't matter if it's Appalachia or not. It could be the city of Richmond. It could be the borough of the Bronx. It could be an elementary school. New kid comes in. Well, you're not familiar to me. I get that.
So how do you tie that into that Bible phrase, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness?
Because if you want forgiveness, you want acceptance, you want something, you're going to have to earn it. And it's not going to be easy or cheap. That's the way I read that thing in its most bland sense. Is look, we will not tolerate you. Go away. What is the thing? The Confederate flag. What does that mean to you, Andrew?
Oh, I mean,
Stars and bars. What does it mean? Well, the first thing, when you ride down the road and you see one, big, red, 6-foot flag, what goes through your mind?
What goes through my mind is that's someone who doesn't have really any black friends because they don't know how much that hurts people as a symbol of division, of slavery, of the Confederacy.
See, I don't see any of that. Not a bit of it. I hear other people talk about it. What I grew up with was this. You can call it heritage or hate, whichever you like. I mean, the both are going on is true. There's a third meaning. Leave me alone. If you're not kin to me, you're not my friend, and I don't know you, go away. Leave me alone. It doesn't matter if you're green and glow in the dark. Leave me alone. And the first thing they're not doing is leaving them alone. They're going on to say heritage hate or making up these other things, say it's very hurtful and all of that. I don't think they intended on that directly. Now, they may be perfectly accepting that that is a byproduct of it. I'll be the first guy to get along with that. But I think there's a third meaning that may not be prevalent, but has to be at least accepted as that it could be one of the possible meanings. Everyone else tells you what you mean. You don't get to tell them. You know, that's the kind of the spin that I was taking on this. Just like the shedding of blood. Just like that billboard. It's got a context to it. It really does. And the fact it is where it is and the way it is speaks to me a little differently. Now, maybe I'm off in the cheap seat somewhere. I don't know. But that's, I mean, I came to you openly, right? Just immediately and said, I don't like this.
I'm glad we're committed to ending on a high note because that's where we're going next. Can you get us there?
I think I can.
After such dark content in this episode, let's turn to a story of light. Huntington, West Virginia continues to be praised for lowering its overdose deaths. So, Chris, you and I both have close family members who have struggled with addiction and who we have worried about very deeply. And in Huntington, that city has earned international news coverage, and it's for tackling the opioid crisis head on instead of trying to sweep it under the rug. So the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said he hasn't seen a community like this anywhere else in America. And that is in Huntington, West Virginia, just 2 hours from where we are here in Bluefield, West Virginia. It was the subject of an Oscar-nominated documentary on Netflix called Heroin. Check it out if you haven't seen it. And basically what's happened in Huntington is law enforcement, the courts, the medical community, the city, everyone is on board to rescue people who overdose and try to get them into treatment. And the great thing is now, after more than a year, I think, of this approach, it's working. And they have the numbers to show it. So if you want to hear more about the books we've talked about, go to hillbillydrugbaby.com. Chris, have you got any thoughts, final thoughts?
Well, today, you know, it's been one of those things that the fact that I have to go someplace else and think about it are my final thoughts. My perspective has been changed somewhat. You know, and it takes me a little time to finish that off.
What do you think? What subject has your perspective been changed on?
My perspective has been changed in that other people's view of this way of life.
So you're seeing things a little bit through the lens of that I bring to it as an outsider. That
Yeah.
I'm trying to make sense of things. I'm trying to understand things.
Yeah. To discuss them, to talk about them, I mean, is the ultimate perspective changer. Not to make accusations. If someone else is telling you what you need to believe, you need to make up your own mind. And you need clear information, whatever that happens to be, to do that with. And that's what I think we're about here.
What a great thought to end on.
Yeah.
And maybe Jesse Ray Lewis will resurface and we'll bring him on the pod at some point.
That would be nice to hear his words here. It really would.
To hear his voice, yeah.
To hear what he has to say.
You can hear a little bit, an excerpt of a phone conversation I had with Jesse Ray at hillbillydrugbaby.com. And Chris, thank you so much. I've always learned so much from you, and hopefully people will learn some about addiction and some about poetry and something about Appalachia by listening to the two of us as we explore these issues.
Thank you, Andrea. I learned more from you than you did from me, so I'll owe you something.
I hope so. All right. Thanks for listening,
Bye,
everybody.
folks.
Join us next time. Bye-bye.